Hey Nindy fans, Tom here and welcome back to another review, and this time we're going to be covering Kingdom Rush Frontiers, which is out now. It's out today, well, as you're watching this, on the Nintendo Switch eShop. Now I just want to put a quick disclaimer in before we get into the review that most of the footage you are seeing is from very early in the game, and I did this just to avoid strategies that I used in the later levels and to avoid spoiling it for you. So anyway, let's get right into things. I do have some issues with this port that are entirely down to the Switch itself, mainly how it controls, but we're going to look at that later on. This will come in the second part of the review though, and first we're going to look at the game itself, starting with the core gameplay and, well, where else would we begin? Kingdom Rush Frontiers is a sequel to the, well, aptly named Kingdom Rush, and was initially released on the mobile format in 2013 and continued from where the first game left off. The entire series of games are cartoon tower defense titles set in fantasy worlds packed with tricky levels, super strong heroes and creative tower types, and of course enemies to take down. The story is presented through stylized comic strips unique to the Nintendo Switch and Steam version, and they do a great job of establishing the context of the upcoming stages. The core format of each stage involves you being plopped into a situation with a point to defend, of course, and then assembling different types of towers in order to prevent the waves of enemies from reaching their goal. So pretty much like every tower defense game ever. Yeah, I guess. You'll work with 4 different tower types and a reinforcement unit, as well as a very helpful meteor strike throughout the entire game. Things don't seem too special yet. The 4 basic towers you can use are the same as the original: melee towers, magic towers, artillery, and finally range towers. All of these can be upgraded though, and the final set of upgrades, 2 for each tower, are brand new and offer completely different strategies to try. As I said, towers are key to tower defense games. I mean, who would have thought that? That's a really interesting idea. Thus, it is crucial that each has its own niche and nuances to keep strategy across levels fresh and dynamic. Fortunately, Frontiers nails it in this regard. The range towers. These are mainly archer towers and are really effective against airborne enemies, as well as providing cover to your troops on the ground. They can be upgraded to a set of fast firing crossbow wielders or high damage axe throwers. They were my favourite type of tower purely because of how flexible they are, and of course they can't be attacked from the ground. Throughout the game you'll probably use the range and melee towers in combination more than any others, purely because of how consistent they are in damage output against enemies throughout the different environments. Melee towers will be acting as your meat shield, and they'll absorb damage and block enemies. In Frontiers they can be upgraded into low health, super speedy assassins or the more powerful but slow Knights of the Templar. Melee towers create choke points which your other towers can bombard with bombs, spells and arrows, so you can clearly see how they're used. In later levels you'll encounter higher tier enemies though who can wipe the floor with your melee towers, but they are always a great way, if used cautiously, of allowing your other towers to rain hell from above. Just don't expect them to deal too much damage in comparison to the others. You'll be let down otherwise, they are very weak. Magic towers can be a key force against armoured enemies, and in Frontiers they can be upgraded from basic magicians into either necromancers who can raise the dead to your cause, or archmages who pull their power together and send out in one highly damaging orb of magical destruction. That sounds pretty epic. Sometimes you do get curveballs thrown in though, which really show the weak side of magic towers. Giant spiders are just one of the many enemies who have a high resistance to magic, and so overloading on magic in these areas will quickly lead to defeat because they just don't do any damage. Frontiers overall does a brilliant job of checking and buffing all the towers in various ways, this being one such example. I've played some strategy games in the past with clear and exploitable metas which dull the game a lot, and Frontiers manages to avoid this tremendously. Finally, we have the artillery towers, and obviously these guys involve bombs, big explosions and lots of splash damage. They are very slow and unwieldy, but the damage they deal is unmatched. The Dwarp, yeah, that's a weird name, but the Dwarp allows you to manipulate nature and create giant earthquakes under the ground, whereas the Battle Mecha gives you a giant robot who you can deploy around the map. I tend to find when I play Kingdom Rush games that artillery towers are my least used tower, mainly because they're really situational to me and much harder to work with as opposed to the other towers. However, playing through Frontiers on this occasion led me to really coming to terms with the Dwarf in particular and how best to use it. I'd definitely say of all the towers in Frontiers they are the ones you're likely to ignore early on, but as you get to grips with the game more they become a more useful tower. And as an overall package I was really impressed with how well balanced the towers in Frontiers are. As I said before, they all exist within a healthy ecosystem of utility, and although personal taste will make you lean towards certain combinations, it is entirely possible to beat each and every level in a multitude of ways using different combinations of them. The biggest issue I have in regards to the towers in Frontiers is that they are pretty much the exact same as the original game before you get these last stage upgrades, but that isn't an issue to newcomers of course, and it doesn't make the game inherently bad, so it's not a massive problem, though it's well worth considering if perhaps you've played the original and are looking at playing Frontiers. Each of the game's levels has customizable difficulty and a total of 3 stars to collect. The star rating you get is dependent on how many lives you have by the end of the level in question. So in theory you can complete a level with 1 life remaining, but more stars mean more upgrades, so it's up to you if you want to go back and try again. We'll get onto the upgrades later too, I promise you. Throughout the game you'll travel through a lot of environments such as deserts and jungles and so on. Each different setting is presented beautifully in the unique Kingdom Rush style, and you'll see some really neat cameos too. In one of the desert levels, a few creatures that are akin to Tusken Raiders from Star Wars will help you take out some enemies from a distant cliff. Think episode 1, the pod race, and you'll see where I'm going with this. The levels themselves are sometimes dynamic too. In one of the forest levels you'll have to completely rebuild your setup because an enemy sets fire to some of the trees, creating a brand new path that they can attack from. It's these small things which prevent Frontiers from suffering from the curse many a tower defense game has problems with. That being, you achieve an optimum strategy and then you just wait for the game to finish because you've done everything you can do. Now, I'd be a fool and an idiot if I didn't address the price disparity between the versions of Frontiers before we discuss other factors such as the heroes themselves. The Switch port costs $15, whereas the mobile version is a fraction of the price. Why? Well, one reason is clear straight away: the heroes are all included in the Switch version of the game, unlike the mobile versions. I did a little bit of homework and the total cost of all heroes in the mobile version of Frontiers is just under $40, so if you look at it that way, you're getting a pretty good deal here to get all the characters for such a good price. Speaking of the heroes, they are a really fun twist on standard gameplay, and each of the 16 is unique and possess upgrade trees to separate from the main system and to capitalise on their unique skills. Some will carry swords, some carry daggers, and a decent chunk utilise range attacks, and one even flies. Each is unlocked through completing certain stages in the story, and once you have them unlocked you can grind to level them up and upgrade them accordingly. Some levels contain unique additional heroes too, which accompany your chosen hero. They are maxed out and brimming with abilities, and they're a real joy to use. Again though, no details to avoid spoilers. I'm trying to really keep this game quite spoiler free. I think the hero system is a refreshing shift from the general gameplay, whilst at the same time the game does a fairly good job at making them not be saviours in any way. If you plan poorly and you let things slip, and they are vulnerable to death too. So yeah, they're not going to bail you out of any awful planning. Unlike the towers, I do think some of the heroes are clearly superior to others. Obviously it makes sense that the later unlocked ones are better, but it's a shame that it'll cause you to throw away a hero you spent a lot of the game with because it just doesn't make any viable sense to use them anymore. This is the legacy of a tiered DLC system though, and I don't think anything could be done without completely changing the game, so it's definitely a problem, but it's hard to avoid. Similar to the way you can upgrade heroes, the stars I mentioned earlier that you get from completing each level allow you to upgrade your towers. You'll also be able to upgrade your reinforcements and the meteor strike, but the core of the upgrades you'll focus on are the towers. How well you defend in a level determines the stars you'll get. As you can see on screen, if you have 18 lives at the end of a level you get 3, 6 to 17 gives you 2, and only 1 to 5 scraping through gives you just 1 star. Just like the use of towers themselves, upgrades are relatively freeform. Each tower has a specific chain of upgrades, but you're free to focus on whichever one you want. Naturally, it makes sense to upgrade the ones you use the most, and this is entirely possible. They range from increasing damage, reducing costs of construction, or simply stronger soldiers. I'd prefer to have more options within each tower if I'm honest. Later on it becomes quite mundane when the upgrades become really minimal and you definitely feel like you lose the freedom from earlier on. It becomes more a job of filling in the blanks of the ones that you haven't got as opposed to really deciding where your future lies with these towers. A couple more things before we get onto the Switch version itself, and they are the enemies and bosses you encounter. For as important as towers are, the enemies are equally important, if not more, because if they're boring, then why would you carry on playing? In total, there are 62 enemies across the 3 environments, as well as 6 bosses, so there's definitely not a lack of variety here. Considering there are 15 levels total in the main game with a plethora of extras to unlock, this is a pretty substantial number. They could just be simple copy and paste on one another though. Fortunately, there is enough variety to keep things spicy right until the end, and some of the bosses are very hard. If I had one issue with the enemies, it would just be how long they can take to roll out sometimes. It can take a few levels for them to really become a lot more interesting. Later on, you'll encounter necromancers who raise the dead and giant spiders who'll scuttle through the lanes, but it takes a fair few levels to get to this point, which is a real shame. Frontiers, like every other Kingdom Rush game, has a unique visual style which is a treat to the eyes. I was really curious though to see how this would translate to a much larger screen, let alone a TV or a monitor. I wouldn't worry though because the fidelity is right on point even on a widescreen monitor, and the game holds up incredibly well. If I'm honest, it doesn't appear like a mobile game. It looks really good and I'm really impressed with how well the team and the developers have managed to bring this game to the Switch. Details and UI are easy to make out on both screens and none of the charm is lost at all. The vibrant jungles and barren deserts beautifully appear and the character models are jam-packed with details to make out and enjoy. Of course, it isn't the best looking game on the Switch, but it does the job, and it does this job whilst looking particularly lovely. I thought it was also worth noting that I had no issues with performance or lag. That's to be expected of course, but it's still worth mentioning. Kingdom Rush Frontiers is a silky smooth experience on both docked and handheld. Now we're going to finish off by speaking about a few more things related exclusively to the Switch version, mainly the controls, but also how the experience translates from mobile to a console setup. Now, the controls aren't terrible by any means, and they're a solid attempt at translating a mobile experience onto a console. That doesn't mean they're great though. At best they are passable, but you definitely lose something compared to the mobile version. As opposed to be able to use a touchscreen to do what you want, you have to cycle through each tower in order to get to the one you want to upgrade or build or so on. But the game is a much better experience in handheld, simply because you can use a touchscreen and it makes it a lot easier to perform important actions. It's still fun in dock, don't get me wrong, but if you're interested in the full fight experience, I'd definitely say go handheld. It feels better, it plays better, and is a much easier experience in this mode. I can't fault Frontiers too much though, because it's a tricky experience to shift over to a controller, and I commend them for the job they did, but it isn't amazing, I have to acknowledge that. Aside from buying the game itself, the whole package is included for free. All the heroes which cost additional money in the mobile version are simply unlocked in the game, which is awesome. Obviously, I was never a fan of the mobile versions being really cheap but bumping up costs through the in-game transactions, especially because the coolest ones were the heroes you had to buy. I mean, they locked a dragon behind a paywall. Who does that to people? This does obviously mean that the cost of the Switch version is considerably higher, but after taking into account the undervalued price of the ports anyway from original mobile releases, I think it's a fairly good balance. You'll have to pay a premium anyway for mobile games on console, and I'm glad that this allows Frontiers to completely eliminate any additional costs for players. With that, my thoughts on Kingdom Rush Frontiers and its Nintendo Switch port are finished. If you can't tell, I think this is a fantastic game. It's one of the best in the tower defense genre, and I'm so glad they are finally releasing these games on the Switch. And Frontiers is a great entry to kick things off with, being many people's favourite. The game is packed with ingenious design, tons of content, and a whole host of replayability. And at this point, I genuinely view it as probably the best tower defense game on the Switch, and thus an essential buy for fans of the genre. If you've never played a tower defense game though, I see no reason why you can't hop in and make this game the one that changes that. For that reason, I'm going to have to award Kingdom Rush Frontiers and Nindy Nexus Golden Heart. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. This was much longer than I anticipated. My initial draft was about 3,500 words, which is definitely my longest ever review, and cutting it down for a YouTube video was very difficult. But if you did, and if I did manage to sway you on this game, be sure to let me know, drop a comment, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, leave a dislike if you didn't, but let us know why. Be sure to subscribe to Nindy Nexus for more indie content, lists and reviews. My name is Tom, thank you so much for watching, peace out.